On the Sherman, it's got one or two nasty habits. The first one is it burns too quickly. The moment a Sherman is hit, it'll go up in flames. The Germans call them Tommy cookers, but that's their sense of humor.
Even in the worst conditions, the German soldier, as far as I have seen him, we definitely felt superior at that time.
The SS always fought hard. They fought to the death.
The beaches are quiet now. But half a century ago, they were the scene of the greatest seaborne invasion in history. The bunkers and gun emplacements of Hitler's Atlantic Wall lie crumbled and ignored. Offshore, the remnants of Mulberry, the Allies' massive artificial harbor, are washed by an indifferent sea. Material relics of the epic struggle to retake Fortress Europe after 4 years of occupation. June 6, 1944, the longest day. A prelude to the longest and bloodiest battle of the Western Front during the entire Second World War.
We're up to the neck in freezing cold water, and with not only our ordinary uniform, but the dungarees over the top of it. And it was as much as we could do to get out of the water. And there were a lot of dead and dying Canadians as I landed with the Canadian division. And they suffered a fair number of casualties, and there were bodies and wounded men. I walked along the top of the sea wall, and I remember seeing a man with the lower part of his face blown away, and the padre was comforting him, and the man wanted to smoke, but there was nowhere to put a cigarette. That shook me a bit.
But the landings on the Normandy beaches marked only the beginning. What followed was more than 2 months of desperate fighting that saw 100 times as many killed and wounded as during the landings themselves.
The Normandy bridgehead was a very, very confined space, just a few miles, with hundreds of thousands of troops concentrated in it. So the first battles, you had burned-out tanks literally all over the place. And if you stopped for the night to rest, to eat, to replenish, it's quite likely that you stopped in amidst a group of burnt-out tanks, or you found bodies around you.
By the beginning of July, nearly 1 million men faced one another along the confined front at Normandy. Americans in the west, British, Canadians, and the bulk of Allied and German armor in the east. 1 full month after the invasion, Hitler remained convinced that the real landings would come at Calais to the north. Deaf to protest, the Fuhrer held his panzer reserves from the fray. But despite this good fortune, by July 6th, Allied forces were still less than 15 miles inland. Once off of the beaches, British and American tankers entered the hedgerow country of Normandy. The Battle of the Hedgerows was confused, sudden, and point-blank.
Well, it gave a hidden anti-tank gun every advantage over you at close range. He was static and hidden. You were moving and quite clear. So he would nearly always get the first shot in. And at such close range, he was almost bound to penetrate you. That was the chief thing. And so you were constantly in terrible danger from something you couldn't see.
With typical American ingenuity, U.S. tanks were soon fitted with hedgerow cutters, constructed from German beach obstacles. But even this enhanced mobility made little difference. With its notoriously weak gun and thin armor, the primary Allied tank, the 34-ton Sherman, was fragile prey to German panzer crews waiting in ambush. 24-year-old Lieutenant Fritz Langenka knocked out 21 enemy tanks in Normandy. For this, he was awarded Nazi Germany's highest military honor, the Knight's Cross.
We just couldn't understand that the country with the highest degree of industrialization, sitting apart from those European powers killing each other for so many years now, wouldn't come to Normandy with the very best tank in the world. We just couldn't understand this, because any Sherman you had in front of a Panzer up to 1,200 meters you could knock out. That was no problem. And being an old tank man, I really I pitied these fellows who had to come up with such an equipment against a Panzer, or let alone a Tiger.
All of a sudden, down this mound came a Panther, moving at speed. And he came down and swung round and faced us at a range of 600 to 800 yards and opened fire. And the first thing we knew was that the tank, two from the head of the column, went up in flames. Cigarette lighter, Tommy Cooker stuff, Sherman gone up. And then the next one, and then the next one. We were like sitting ducks at a fairground. But this fellow was sitting there, this German gunner, he was having a field day. He just sat there and picked us off, and we lost 8 tanks in that morning before the RAF came and sorted them out.
There's no doubt that the Allies made a philosophical error when they were planning the industrial production for the second half of the Second World War. That the Americans in particular believed that if you had enough of your weapons, whether these were aircraft, whether these were tanks, whether these were rifles, whether these were machine guns, that this could outweigh any qualitative disadvantage. It didn't matter whether the German weapons were better. But on the battlefield, men found that it mattered very much.
On the Sherman, it's got one or two nasty habits. The first one is it burns too quickly. The moment the Sherman is hit, it'll go up in flames. And I told you the other day the Germans called them Tommy Cookers, but that's their sense of humor.
We had the 15 Germans against us, and the 15 Germans started with fire against us. I received on the turret some hits. Although I'm in feelings this inside, but it is not dangerous.
Here, for the first time, the Allies faced the most fearsome armored vehicle of the Second World War, the 68-ton King Tiger. With frontal armor nearly 8 inches thick, it was practically invulnerable at even point-blank range, but routinely destroyed Shermans from over a mile away.
Once the Tiger came along with this 88mm gun, I mean, we were just a piece of bread and they were a knife. They'd go straight through us.
88 solid shot was whistling all over the place, and I went behind a house to get out of his field of fire, and about 1 minute later I was bailing out of my tank, which was on fire. The 88 tank gun had fired through 5 walls of a house, and it still penetrated my tank and got into the petrol. So that shows you something of the power of that gun.
If you've got to get out, you've got to get out quick. And if your turret is damaged, or if your gunner is killed, you can't traverse. And so the poor old driver or co-driver has a genuine case of hard luck if that happens. And I have seen this happen. I've seen a tank get hit, burnt. The gun left at 11 o'clock right over the driver's hatch. And we could see the tank burning and exploding, and you could see that hatch being opened by the driver. But there's no way he could have gone out.
For centuries, the fields and quiet villages of Normandy have been the pastoral backdrops of a beautiful land. By the summer of 1944, the Germans had turned this charming countryside into a deadly labyrinth, concealing troops determined to make the Allies pay dearly for their victory. For the first time, Hitler's armies in the West were fighting for national survival. Their stand became a bitter and fanatic one.
The door of a house opened, and a little boy came, well, little boy, 14, 15 perhaps, carrying a Panzerfaust. And he was no more than 12 feet from the side of this Sherman. And the sergeant on the tank looked down and was just going to shout to this boy, and the boy fired his Panzerfaust. And he hit the tank with such force from 12 feet that that tank was destroyed. The sergeant, all the crew were killed, in fact. It was suicidal, mark you, because he didn't live long to relish his victory.
What would happen is your leading tanks would go up the road probably 300 or 400 yards in front of myself, and the chaps with their Panzerfausts would lie in the ditches, and then as the two tanks went by, they knocked them out with their Panzerfaust and then put their hands up. And that was when, for once, we didn't accept the surrenders, and they were usually cut in half by the tank coming up from behind.
Rage, fear, and the confusion of combat meant that surrender, for the men of both sides, was never a sure passage to survival.
When we were all young and we read the earlier books were written about the Second World War, I think we tended to take an idealized view. We believed that only the Germans shot prisoners, and on the whole, the British and the Americans behaved like gentlemen. The Germans did more of it, whereas it was very seldom Allied policy to kill prisoners. But I never forgot the shock when I was researching the Normandy campaign and I found an order from Bradley, who was by any standards one of the most civilized as well as distinguished American commanders, to his divisional commanders saying, I don't want to hear too much about officers or units sending in snipers as prisoners, that we don't want any of this stuff about snipers thinking they can shoot our people to the last minute and then surrender. We don't want to see any German snipers brought back here.
I wouldn't call it common policy. I don't think it was a policy, but there was no doubt that people had this deeply in their mind. It doesn't mean that SS were not taken prisoner. They were. Lots were. But there were many occasions when perhaps they might have been taken prisoner and were not. Mark you, there were very few armies which claimed to be absolutely pure throughout that war.
Among the most able and savage units in Normandy were those of Hitler's Waffen-SS. Expertly trained and intensely motivated, they were hated, feared, and often given no quarter by the Allied troops they faced.
They did carry out atrocities, and the Canadians in particular suffered extremely badly from them in the early stages of the Normandy thing. And of course, then the Canadians started going for them in a big way, and everybody else. But the feeling amongst most British troops in Normandy that I had any dealings with was that really extermination was the only answer to them.
Early on, the 12th SS Hitler Youth Division established a particularly grisly reputation for the wholesale massacre of Canadian POWs.
Its soldiers had been recruited as Hitler Youth boys at the age of 16 or 17 in 1943. They were completely inexperienced, but all the officers and NCOs were SS Panzer soldiers from the Eastern Front. So you had this combination of extremely experienced leaders plus highly malleable young soldiers with very high degree of commitment to the Nazi Party.
The indoctrination of some people is much more successful than of others. And on one occasion, my tank was advancing very slowly, and we found a member of the Hitler Youth in a ditch, apparently dying. We had to halt nearby, and so my driver and I got out and went over to see this lad, who was probably about 16, 17 years of age, absolutely pallid. He hadn't very many moments to live. And my driver got his water bottle and came over to give this lad a drink. And I saw the lad making feeble movements, and he was pulling out a pistol and was going to shoot my driver. And so we grabbed the revolver and threw it into the field and went away and left him. He wouldn't take water from us.
We have learned that we were named after the war, or that we were named fanatics. We have heard this word only after the war. It was unknown to us. There are so many of us who lost their home, their parents, when all cities and even smaller towns were bombarded. And everyone, almost everyone, was determined to do its best to fight them. Nobody of us would have thought we were fanatic. We were good soldiers, hard-fighting soldiers. The will of fighting, if necessary, to the last. Yeah, that was in every man, I would think. Everyone was really willing to sacrifice himself. Yeah. But whether this is fanatic, if you want to call it so, but it was a strange word. It's always a strange word to me. Heroes, I don't know. That was also a word that was not used.
Outnumbered on the ground and overwhelmed by enemy air power, German troop movement during the day was nearly impossible. By August, the rail and road network supporting Axis supply lines had been rocketed and bombed out of existence. Shell shock, hitherto an unrecognized condition in SS units, became a significant problem. Still, Hitler's army held on.
We all grew up with a lot of cliches about the German soldier as the squarehead who in the movies the German sentry had always turn his back so that the British or American commando could stab him and go on and attack the gun position or the bunker. In real life, it wasn't like that. One of the extraordinary features of the German soldier was his initiative. The Germans depended above all on brilliant small unit leadership. They had fewer officers in proportion to other ranks in the Allied armies, and their NCOs and even their other ranks would take it for granted that if their officers were killed, they would go on.
At that time, we felt superior. Not only in regard of the tanks, but also quality of our training and so on. We knew what tremendous army was building up against us. And even in the worst conditions, the German soldier, as far as I have seen him in my unit, which was admittedly a very, very, very exclusive unit, we definitely felt superior at that time.
It seemed to us that the training with some of the American armed forces we met there wasn't the very best. For example, I was standing there at one place and an American reconnoitering tank party approached our position. The first tank had the gun in what I consider to be march position. It wasn't leveled and ready to shoot, you know. It came up here like making a nice visit to some French family, you know.
What the history books don't tell you is that all those Allied divisions were at their full establishment of tanks and men, whereas in many cases those German divisions were reduced to a handful of tanks, to a shattered remnant of men, almost literally cooks, clerks, bottle washers, all pulled together. And the extent to which those men proved still capable of resistance in the last stages, especially of the Normandy campaign, is quite extraordinary.
I wouldn't call them superior. In the end, the Allies won. I mean, and, you know, the winner is superior. But they were up against a very high-quality enemy. They were fighting a defensive battle. It was on ground which was suited to defense. There's a lot of cover, a lot of banks, hedges, ditches, good country to defend. But that still meant that they had to have resolution and determination. They had to sit and fight where they were. And they lost huge, really huge numbers of men doing so.
German divisions, like the 12th SS Panzer, came to Normandy in June with 20,000 men and 150 tanks. Before battle's end, they were down to 300 men and 12 tanks.
The German commanders never had the intention to waste their men, but in the circumstances, what could you do? What could you do? After some days, the division was withdrawn for a rest, but then it was necessary to put it again in without refreshment, without anything, since there was nothing behind. Yeah? So, yes, the net result was a waste. A waste of first-class young men. Yes, that's correct.
In desperation, on August 7th, Hitler ordered a suicidal counterattack. Allied air forces tore the German columns and supply lines apart before they hardly had time to assemble. Those left alive pressed on.
I have to say that one of the most heroic things I saw was on the part of German troops. We saw the German infantry following the tanks, and obviously at about 300 or 400 yards range, we began to fire at them. You have to remember that the cornfields were in full golden ripeness, and cornfields are very dry areas. And as soon as our tracer bullets went into the cornfields, they took fire. And so the Germans were being asphyxiated, they were being shot, they were being burned, and they still kept coming. They kept coming and coming until one wondered what one had to do in order to stop them reaching our positions. What actually happened was that so many of them suffered either from the direct shooting or from the burning of the cornfield, from the smoke and so on, that in the end it was more than flesh and blood could stand. But as they were at that point where it seemed that they were not going to be denied, it was King Canute and the sea coming in, and you kept saying stop, stop, and the sea kept coming in. At that point there was a feeling of tremendous terror. You were hoping that the colonel would say retreat, and he didn't, so you had to stay.
The German assault ended in disaster. Those that survived found themselves stuck in a noose from which they would never escape. Surrounded in an enclosed valley called Falaise, the wreckage of an army once 500,000 strong was pummeled round the clock by Allied planes and artillery. It became a killing zone of immense proportion.
I've known experienced British soldiers shake their heads and say, I saw things in the Falaise Gap that I wish I'd never seen. I think that it was slaughter on a vast scale. It destroyed equipment of all sorts, and lots of German soldiers who'd got caught by Allied air power and been killed. They were trying to escape in formation, and they got killed in formation.
The struggle ended on August 22nd. In 2 long months of bitter fighting, over 450,000 men had been wounded or had lost their lives. In newly liberated Normandy, another 12,000 civilians also perished. What remained of Hitler's army fled eastward as Allied armor columns launched into a race for the German frontier through roads choked with legions of their vanquished foe. Over 200,000 fell into captivity. It was a blow from which the Third Reich would never recover.
I had experience once or twice with taking Germans prisoner, and at that moment there was no distinction of race. It was a purely human sentiment. A few minutes before, we'd been trying to kill a lot of them. Now they were human beings like us, and we've been sitting down, and the first thing they do is to take out their wallet and say, I've got some kids at home, there's the picture of my family. And again, you get this incredible reaction to the iniquity and the irrelevance and the nonsensical factor of war, that human beings immediately can establish a rapport, but the politicians couldn't.
After 5 years of bloodshed, many were left broken and numb by defeat. Most were simply relieved to awaken from the nightmare of war.